I tried to do my personal finance class, but it was gone. I know, it makes it look more saying it's so set up. It is. Yeah. I always try to lost. Yeah. Yeah. So then it just give us that error.
All right. So we're going to pick up where we left off and power through this last little bit of acid-base balance so that we are all ready for our exam. When we left off last time, we'd been talking about the basics of pH as relates to physiology and especially as relates to the respiratory system. So today we're going to tack on what our kidneys are doing in all of this and why we're talking about this here in our renal unit. Okay, so we're going to make a brief mention of a couple more interactions that are going on in the kidneys, some more complications before we get to that, really just because they're in the same section of your textbook. So this is really just a reminder. I don't need you to focus a ton on these additional little pieces, but reminder that things we have going on in our regulated portions of the nephron. So in those late distal tubules and in the collecting ducts, we have the action of a bunch of hormones there. So we talked about ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and its main role being reabsorbing water, right, by inserting aquaporin 2 on that apical membrane, so the one facing the filtrate that's about to become urine, right? Letting water into the cell, exiting out the basolateral membrane into the peritubular fluid and then the plasma through aquaporin 3. This is just a note that it does actually also have kind of a secondary effect. It's not the main one we're focused on, but ADH actually does kind of increase the number of sodium channels a little bit on the apical membrane. It's kind of a secondary effect. Angiotensin 2, which we talked about as part of that RAS system. That was in our flow chart. We had our renin, angiotensin 1, and being converted by those ACE enzymes into angiotensin 2, ultimately telling your adrenal glands to produce aldosterone, right? So aldosterone was our main way that we would increase sodium reabsorption and create some potassium secretion. Happens to be the case that angiotensin 2 also loops back and increases secretion of ADH. And finally, the last hormone we talked about really was ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. So that was the one related to the heart. Okay. So what that one usually does is it stops you from reabsorbing too much sodium, right? Because it wants to kind of protect your heart and therefore not increase blood volume. At the same time as it does that, it loops back and decreases ADH secretion. So it's also kind of blocking some water reabsorption. So these are secondary effects here where we have our water balance and our electrolyte balance kind of pairing together. Okay. So this means that when we are thinking about how everything goes together, we can relate a lot of these things to their effects on blood pressure in the form of mean arterial pressure MAP, right? So for example, we had someone hemorrhaging, losing blood, they'd be decreasing their blood volume, which means we'd see a decrease in their blood pressure, in their MAP, that mean arterial pressure. Yeah. So we know that decreases in MAP, one thing that we have happen immediately, normally, is our baroreceptor reflex. Right, so we talked about that when we talked about the vasculature. It's also relevant here. So that's our nerves controlling our heart and telling our vasculature to increase resistance to bring that blood pressure back up. And now we know that in the kidneys, we have hormonal control of that blood volume, primarily through ADH, antidiuretic hormone. So in the case where we had a decrease in blood volume, we would want to try to keep that back up. So we'd try to reabsorb as much water as we could, which means we'd want a bunch of ADH being produced. And because there is this linkage between ADH and that RAS system, right, that we can use this renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system to reabsorb sodium and then trigger the secretion of ADH, which will then tell us to reabsorb water. We'd also see that taking in a case where we had a loss of blood volume like this. So all our pieces of regulation kind of fit together into a more complicated system when we think about the kidneys and their role in the body at large. Okay. So everything that was on those slides, I think the amount that you want to know about that is really stuff that we've covered already in other sections of this unit. So what we're going to head into now is this interplay between respiration, breathing, and the lungs, and renal function. So the kidneys and how they're working together with a different organ system, not just interacting with themselves and hormones that we've already talked about with relation to the kidneys. Okay, so reminder, our normal pH, our baseline pH that we want for our plasma is going to be somewhere around 7.4. So we've got some wiggle room, 7.35 to 7.45, you're good. If we're lower, we're in acidosis, so too acidic. If we're higher, we've got alkalosis, so we're too basic, too alkaline. Okay. So we have problems if we get outside our normal range, right? We have a change in the shape of proteins. Proteins do practically everything in your body, so this is a big problem. We are particularly concerned about the effect of these pH changes on nerves and the signaling. So in the case of acidosis, we'd have a decrease in the excitability of neurons. So we're making it harder to fire off action potentials. In alkalosis, our nerves are now kind of too jittery. They send off action potentials when we don't want them to. Happens to be the case that acid-base balance is a little bit linked to potassium balance. So we might see in cases where we have a patient with hyperkalemia, so too much potassium, that's kind of paired with acidosis, right? So potassium positive ion there paired with acidosis. In alkalosis, so too basic pH in your blood, we might see that paired with hypokalemia, so too low potassium there. And overall, we'd see other symptoms like potentially cardiac arrhythmias, so like your heart beating in the wrong rhythm, or broad vasodilation, so your blood vessels dilating too much, things like this. We don't like our, bless you, acid-base balance to be disturbed. We really want to regulate the pH of our blood. Okay. So when we're thinking about the ways that we might affect our blood pH other than breathing, right? So last time we talked about respiration and how if we have a lot of carbon dioxide in the plasma, carbon dioxide acts as an acid, so that lowers pH. Opposite, if we lose carbon dioxide, if you don't have enough carbon dioxide in your blood, you're kind of raising pH, making it more basic, more alkaline. And now that we're talking about the kidneys, we want to tack on some other things that might affect your pH. Okay. So one is just what you're eating. So you do have potentially minor changes based on your diet. This is because of how we break down or metabolize some of the components of our food, particularly proteins and fats. So proteins, right? We break into amino acids. Amino acids can add to the acidity of your blood. Fats, they've got those fatty acid chains on them, right? So they can also add into the acidity of your blood. So add into how many hydrogen ions we would measure there in the blood. Okay. In terms of cellular metabolism, so like our classic aerobic respiration or anaerobic respiration that we talked about back in ANP1, we know that when we make ATP, right, our byproduct, place where all that carbon and that glucose is going, is getting put into carbon dioxide, which is why that's our waste product that we have to breathe out, right? So carbon dioxide is coming from cellular function, from cellular metabolism, breaking down glucose. In the case where we are just doing lots of glycolysis, right? So if we are doing some anaerobic metabolism, quickly making smaller amounts of ATP, we might have lactic acid buildup because that is one of our important byproducts there, allowing us to do that anaerobic process in some of our cells, particularly in some of our muscles, right? That happens to be the case that also keto acids are another type of acid you might be producing as you break down other molecules to make ATP. Okay. So that's how we get acidity into the blood, right? So we're talking about low pH here, or at least the low side of our pH, right? This is contributing to the degree of acidity that we do see in the blood pH. Now, when we want to get rid of acidity, so when we want to get rid of like hydrogen ions, these extra charges that are causing excessive acidity, we can breathe it out, right? So we can breathe out carbon dioxide, which is what we talked about last time. And we can excrete it, urinate, pee, right? Hydrogen ions can come out in your urine. So out from the kidneys into your bladder, out your urethra. So these are two ways of getting rid of excess hydrogen ions, either in the form of hydrogen ions directly or converting them into CO2. Okay. So we're remembering that carbon dioxide is a biological acid. So if you have too much carbon dioxide, your pH of your blood is going to be too low, and you're going to be in respiratory acidosis. Okay. And this is because we have this reversible reaction where we convert carbon dioxide and water to carbonic acid, which can eventually become bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. Right, so if we go all the way this way, we've made a bunch of hydrogen ions. This is why this acts as a biological acid. Okay? So this is going to be a situation that can cause a pH disturbance, or we have a pH disturbance for one of these other reasons, right? Like if it has to do with your diet or your kidneys, and that's why your pH is off, you can fix it with your breathing, right? You could change your breathing rate potentially to adjust carbon dioxide levels and therefore adjust the pH. Okay. So numbers we want to remember as our like normal baseline, right? We've got that range that we're trying to stay in, 7.35 to 7.45 for our normal blood pH. From our respiratory unit, our normal partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood in your arteries should be 40 millimeters of mercury. So that's our baseline. That's what we want. When we vary from that, we have our chemoreceptors in our brain that sense variation in particularly carbon dioxide partial pressures, carbon dioxide concentration, and adjust your breathing rate to get you back to this kind of set point of 40 millimeters of mercury. Okay. So some of that carbon dioxide could be coming from metabolism as a byproduct of making ATP. Carbon dioxide that we think of as being the responsibility of our respiratory system. We're thinking about it that way, not because of the carbon dioxide we breathe in, but because your lungs' job is to breathe carbon dioxide out, right? They pick up carbon dioxide when we have the blood going to tissue, right? So when we're coming back up to the lungs, our venous blood would have a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and it should be getting kicked out of your body when you breathe out from your lungs. Okay. So if that doesn't happen correctly or doesn't happen at the right speed, we've got a problem. So if we're keeping too much carbon dioxide in our body, we're in respiratory acidosis. If we are getting rid of carbon dioxide too fast, believe it or not, that actually kind of is a problem. So if you get rid of carbon dioxide too fast, you don't have enough carbon dioxide in your blood, and you'd be in respiratory alkalosis, because this has to do with the lungs. They should be keeping your carbon dioxide at the appropriate level. Okay. So thinking about that respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, let's link that up to some of our words about breathing rates. So for respiratory alkalosis, would this be a case where you're hyperventilating or a case where you're hypoventilating? Take another couple seconds. You got a 50-50 shot. Oops. All right. So in respiratory alkalosis, I didn't click an answer, it's just picking whichever one's higher. Okay. So in respiratory alkalosis, the problem actually is hyperventilation. Sorry. It's that you are breathing out too much carbon dioxide. And this means that you don't have enough carbon dioxide left in your blood. So we have this situation where we don't have a balance between the carbon dioxide and the bicarbonate that we have in our bodies. Okay. So for the other side, the kidney side, when we have problems in the pH that don't have to do with your breathing, right? So metabolic acidosis is going to be when we're eating wrong. We've got a high protein diet or high fat diet, contributing amino acids, contributing fatty acids, creating acidity in that blood pH. Maybe heavy exercise, adding keto acids, lactic acid. Severe diarrhea also causes metabolic acidosis. So in the case of severe diarrhea, what's happening is that in your GI system, you have a bunch of bicarbonate that's supposed to be balancing out acidity in your stomach. So if things are going through you too fast, you're losing a lot of bicarbonate before it could be reabsorbed. So this means you don't have enough of the buffer, basically, for that acidity in the plasma. And finally, straight up, your kidneys can cause a problem. So if your kidneys are not working right, if you have renal dysfunction, the job of the kidneys, now one of the many jobs of the kidneys, has to do with secreting the right amount of hydrogen ions into your filtrate and therefore excreting them in your urine, and also reabsorbing the appropriate number of bicarbonate ions or potentially creating them. So if your kidney cells aren't working right, aren't doing their jobs right, you might end up in metabolic acidosis. So particularly if you're not reabsorbing enough bicarbonate, wouldn't be in your blood to balance out any extra hydrogen ions or CO2. Okay. Finally, our final way we might have a problem with our plasma pH, right? We've got respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, metabolic acidosis. Now, finally, metabolic alkalosis. So your pH is too basic, too alkaline, okay? So too high. And this is for a reason that doesn't have to do with your carbon dioxide. If it's your carbon dioxide, it's your lungs' fault. Okay. So this might be if you have stomach bug or you've eaten something and you're vomiting way too much. Your stomach has a lot of hydrogen in it. So hydrogen ions, and as we'll see, hydrochloric acid, part of what's breaking down your food. So if you vomit a lot, get rid of those hydrogen ions from the stomach. This can lift that pH up and make your plasma more basic because you're losing these hydrogen ions. This could also come from, if you want to call it diet. You wouldn't normally on purpose eat enough baking soda to do this, but if you consume something that's very alkaline, like a whole thing of baking soda, right, then you might end up with alkalinity of the blood plasma, right? So you absorb too much of something that is basic, then you can make your pH too basic. And finally, again, your kidneys can be messing up their balancing act. So their job is to reabsorb or potentially make the right amount of bicarbonate and bring it into your blood and to secrete the right amount of hydrogen ions. So you excrete them as urine. If they don't do that, if they get that wrong rate, can also cause alkalosis. Okay. So anytime we have a disturbance, so anytime our blood pH is not in that 7.35 to 7.45 range, we have some options to try and fix it or try and compensate for it, right? Like you might end up with some normal variation throughout your day, depending on what you eat, depending on how hard you're working out, right? And you want your body to be able to tolerate that. You want your body to be able to regulate that pretty easily. So in order, basically, of how fast this would act, the first thing we would do is to buffer it out, buffer any changes out. So if you have too many hydrogen ions, we can use hemoglobin, but usually, most importantly, bicarbonate. That's our main buffer to kind of soak them up. We don't have enough, maybe that little bicarbonate sponge lets go of some. So we're keeping ourselves in that normal range through the buffering action of bicarbonate, usually. This can only really like limit changes in pH. We can't totally fix blood pH long-term unless we change the amount of buffer, right? But if you're just eating a little extra protein, right? The bicarbonate and other buffers in your blood should be able to handle that until things go back to normal. Next thing is going to happen. All right, we don't have enough buffer. We're actually seeing a change to the pH, even though we have some buffer in our plasma. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is change our breathing. Okay. So that's our respiratory compensation. So if we see a pH change, part of our homeostatic regulatory mechanism is going to be to try to breathe faster or slower to adjust, to use that carbon dioxide to get us into the right range. And this can actually actively change your pH, right? Because that carbon dioxide is an acid, you're either bringing it in or breathing it out. So you are actually changing the composition of the blood here. And finally, a little bit slower, we have our renal compensation. So this can also actually actively change the pH of your blood, part of our homeostasis. And the way that the kidneys are going to adjust is that they're going to either and or both, right? They can change how many hydrogen ions they secrete. So if we secrete, we're taking basically out of the blood into the urine, right? And then out of the body. So we're removing them completely. Or we can change how much bicarbonate we are reabsorbing, so pulling into the body, or synthesizing, so making, which we would then also pull into the body. So we can essentially add more buffer to the plasma. And then that buffer is going to act just like the normal buffers that are already in your plasma. Okay. So depending on what our problem is, We might do this in either direction. So if we have more hydrogen ions, so an increase in this concentration, which means a drop in pH, we'd want to get rid of our hydrogen ions and add more bicarbonate into our plasma. If we have the opposite situation, so here we have our alkalosis, we're going to want to decrease how many hydrogen ions we're secreting. We're going to increase how many bicarbonate ions we're reabsorbing. Okay. So the quickest thing, buffering, helps us have a very fast response to a change in pH. The most important buffer is bicarbonate, and bicarbonate is your kidney's job, at least for now. And the reason this works is we can take our bicarbonate and our hydrogen ions and turn them into carbonic acid. There are other buffers that exist. The other ones we might be particularly interested in when we're thinking about the renal system are ones that are inside your cells. So in your intracellular fluid, proteins can actually sometimes act as a buffer. So we can tack on a hydrogen ion, we can protonate proteins. Phosphates can also act as a buffer inside your cells. So if we take phosphates, we can also kind of tack on hydrogen ions there. But the most important one for us is bicarbonate. So respiratory compensation, that second line of defense. So first, if our buffers can handle it, we don't have to worry. Buffers got this under control. Next, in a couple minutes, as we alter our breathing rate, we are going to be able to change CO2 levels. So when we think about ventilation rates, I always want to think about breathing out CO2. Okay. So if we increase ventilation, so we breathe faster, we are breathing out more CO2, which means you have less CO2 left in the plasma. Okay. So you are bringing that pH up. In the case that we slow down our breathing, we're not breathing out enough CO2. Now that CO2 is still hanging out in the plasma. So we're going to see an increase in the acidity of our blood, which is a decrease in pH. Okay. So overall, the way this should be controlled is we have sensors that can sense the pH of our plasma. Okay. So if we have a drop in the pH in our plasma, which is the same thing as saying increasing acidity, we have chemoreceptors, specifically peripheral chemoreceptors that can sense this. Okay. And what they're going to do is they're going to increase your ventilation because we're trying to breathe off that acidity. So as we breathe off that acidity, our partial pressure of carbon dioxide drops, so it goes down. We're getting rid of carbon dioxide because we're breathing it out, which means that our plasma pH goes back up and goes back to normal, which means we have a negative feedback loop, turning this all off once we're back to normal. Okay. So moving on to our final method, right? So now we're going to be thinking about this metabolic compensation, this renal compensation, we should say. We are going to be thinking about our buffers and we're going to be thinking about hydrogen ions. So which of these two could bring your pH back up if it goes down? Thinking about from the perspective of the blood. So adding buffer to the blood, getting rid of hydrogen ions from the blood, taking away less buffer in the blood, or adding hydrogen ions to the blood. Okay, take another couple seconds. All right, cool. All right, so yeah, so a drop in pH means we've got lots of hydrogen ions in the blood, right? So the two ways that we can adjust for that, right? Straight up, we could get rid of them, right? If you get rid of hydrogen ions, when there are too many hydrogen ions, you're golden. The other thing that we can do, which is gonna be the main thing that our kidneys are doing, but they do both of these things. We can make more buffer and pull that buffer into the bloodstream to soak up those extra hydrogen ions like a sponge. Okay. So this is how our renal compensation is going to work. We're thinking about these two pieces. So making or reabsorbing bicarbonate into the blood to adjust for extra acidity, extra hydrogen ions, extra CO2, right? Secreting hydrogen ions into the filtrate and therefore removing them from the body as urine. Okay. So this is our third line of defense against acid-base disturbances because it takes longer. So hours to days potentially for us to do enough of this that it actually has an effect. But that's good for like long-term stuff. Okay. So we're going to be regulating how many hydrogen ions we are excreting, which means what we're doing is secreting them into the nephron and then excreting them out of the body. So hydrogen ions. And then we're going to be thinking about bicarbonate. So bicarbonate can be reabsorbed into your blood at different rates, or we can let some of that bicarbonate stay in the urine and get eliminated from the body through urine. And we can actually also synthesize, so we can make new bicarbonate ions in our renal tubule cells. And we'll take a look at how and why we do that. But if you make new bicarbonate, it then goes into your blood. So from the pH perspective, synthesis of bicarbonate ions is going to have the same effect as reabsorbing more bicarbonate ions. Okay. So usually we're often focusing on acidity when we're focusing on pH. So when we have increases in acidity in the blood, right, what we're talking about is we've got a bunch of hydrogen ions here in the blood. Okay, so lots of hydrogen. Cool. Right. So the ways we can fix that, or we can either kick them out. Right. So secrete them into the tubules and then excrete them out of your body. Or we can grab some bicarbonate. Bring it in and pair them up, buffer them out. So we're going to take a second to look at how that works and how our kidneys kind of treat these substances. Okay. So different things are going to be happening in different parts of the nephron. So first we're going to think about normal conditions. And like with our water, our glucose, our sodium, our potassium, we're mainly going to be thinking about, okay, what happens in the proximal tubule, and then what happens at the end in the distal tubule and the collecting duct. Okay, so when you're taking in bicarbonate, bicarbonate gets filtered out of those glomerular capillaries into Bowman's space and Bowman's capsule, ends up in your proximal tubule. Okay. In that proximal tubule, in this first part of the nephron, you do reabsorb a lot of that bicarbonate. So you want to take back 80 to 90% and put it back in the blood. So we're reabsorbing it into those peritubular capillaries. And this is going to be paired to hydrogen ion secretion. So in the proximal tubule itself, we have bicarbonate being reabsorbed. We've talked about a lot of reabsorption happening in the proximal tubule. But at the same time, we are actually going to be secreting, even in the proximal tubule, some hydrogen ions, okay? This is hopefully not a surprise, going to be a little bit linked to reabsorption of sodium, which we know drives an awful lot of processes in our body. So we'll take a look at that. Now, go through the loop of Henle. We're not going to do much adjustment there. The next place we're going to dial in on is the distal tubule and the collecting duct, which we're just going to treat as one. Okay. So in the distal tubule and the collecting duct, what we're going to do, again, we're going to secrete hydrogen ions. This time, in this distal part of the nephron, a lot of what we're going to be doing under normal conditions is synthesizing new bicarbonate. So we were reabsorbing bicarbonate in the proximal tubule. So bicarbonate that was already in your plasma got filtered into the nephron, reabsorbing it, just taking it back. In the distal tubule and the collecting duct, we're going to be converting some stuff into new bicarbonate ions that we then take into the blood. Okay. So under normal conditions, we are taking these bicarbonate ions that we're making and adding them to the plasma. And at the same time, like in the proximal tubule, we're going to be secreting some hydrogen ions. So hydrogen ions are going to go out of your cells and then out of the body again here in the distal tubule and collecting duct. Okay. So first we're looking at the proximal tubule here. Okay. So what we want to focus in on, we have our familiar sodium potassium pump here, right? We know that that's adjusting our sodium concentration. So we have a gradient to work with. Okay. What we're interested from our perspective as we're thinking about blood pH. So we want to notice our bicarbonate ions. Okay. So ultimately, bicarbonate ions are moving into your bloodstream, right? So our plasma is over here on the right, because that's the basolateral side of the cell. So plasma would be there. Okay. So here we have reabsorption of our bicarbonate. Okay. And the other thing that we're focusing on is the secretion of the hydrogen ions. So here we see hydrogen ions being secreted. So they're going out. Okay. Hydrogen ions are going out into that tubular fluid, which means that if they stay there, which you're gonna excrete them out in your urine. So we're going opposite directions here. The reason this counts as reabsorption for those bicarbonate ions has to do with where they're coming from. So what's happening is that you're filtering bicarbonate. So this means it came in at the glomerulus because it was in your plasma, right? So it was already in your body. We have hydrogen ions. Some of them are coming from this ongoing secretion process. We take those bicarbonate ions, merge them together with these hydrogen ions, and here's our carbonic acid. Okay. When we convert this into water and CO2, okay, because CO2 can get into your cell easy, so nonpolar gas can diffuse into this proximal tubule epithelial cell. So that's why this is a dotted line, is because CO2 doesn't need to go through a protein, doesn't need a transporter or channel or anything, just goes straight across the membrane. Okay. Once we have CO2 here in the cell, we put it back together, right? So we're adding CO2 and water together again, getting carbonic acid again, breaking it up. Here we have those hydrogen ions. We're going to put them back into the filtrate. So we're secreting them, right? So we didn't take any in overall. And in fact, overall, we end up secreting some hydrogen to leave the body. But we take these bicarbonate ions, right, that were originally filtered in through the glomerulus into this proximal tubule. We take those bicarbonate ions and move them into your blood. So we can do that either along with sodium. So this is co-transport of sodium and bicarbonate. We've got some proteins that do that. Or sometimes we do counter transport with chloride ions. So they go opposite directions, but it works the same way. So we've got this active process helping us reabsorb our bicarbonate ions. This is a little different than the situation for the distal tubule and the collecting duct. Okay. So the reason this is different is that when we're looking at the distal tubule and the collecting duct, notice we're not looking for bicarbonate ions pre-existing in the tubular fluid, right? So we don't have our bicarbonate over here. Okay. We're making new bicarbonate here. Okay. So the way we do that, right, is basically through this carbon dioxide and water reaction into carbonic acid. So like this cell might be making some ATP, making some CO2 as a byproduct. So staying inside the cell, that CO2 could be combined with water to make this carbonic acid, which we would then use our enzyme carbonic anhydrase to pull apart into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. We're going to pull this new bicarbonate ion into the plasma. So this same direction. So same direction as reabsorption, but we made it new. So it's synthesis. Okay. That hydrogen ion, I'm going to leave the cell on the opposite side. So this is exactly the same direction as before in the proximal tubule. So this is again secretion of hydrogen ions. So we can get rid of hydrogen ions and we can either reabsorb or make new bicarbonate ions. And they're going to come into the plasma. So that's what happens normally. So normally bicarbonate is being reabsorbed into the plasma in your proximal tubule. It's going to be synthesized in the collecting duct and in the late distal tubule, pulled into your plasma. And in both locations, we're secreting hydrogen ions, so getting rid of them, putting them into the tubular fluid, excreting them as urine. And if we have a severe acid-base disturbance, we're going to have one more nifty thing that your nephron can do. Okay. So this is happening actually in the proximal tubule. So this would happen if you have really severe acidosis, so really big dose of extra hydrogen ions in your blood plasma. We're going to do this in the proximal tubule. Basically, the big picture here is that normally the proximal tubule is just reabsorbing bicarbonate that was already in your body. In severe acidosis, it can also synthesize bicarbonate. So it can also make new bicarbonate, just like the distal tubule and collecting duct, but it does it through a different mechanism. So instead of using CO2 and water and turning that into bicarbonate that you synthesize, which is what happened in the distal tubule and the collecting duct, what happens in these severe cases of acidosis in the proximal tubule is we take something else called glutamine. So glutamine is another thing that we can convert ultimately into some bicarbonate ions. So here we see that bicarbonate. Here we see ammonia and hydrogen ions would be the other part of the glutamine. But this is our newly synthesized bicarbonate. And we're pulling it into the plasma to buffer out any extra acidity here. Okay. So hydrogen ions, we're always thinking about secreting them, getting rid of them. The only question is, how many of them are we getting rid of? Bicarbonate, we're always thinking about bringing it into the plasma. We're either doing that through reabsorption or through synthesis. That depends on location and the degree of severity of our acidosis. So this is all because we want to keep our nice balance between our acidic components and our more basic components. So we know that we want to keep a 20-to-1 balance between bicarbonate ions and carbon dioxide, which is why we compare this to our breathing. So we're in acidosis anytime we have too few bicarbonate ions or too much carbon dioxide. We're in alkalosis anytime we have too many bicarbonate ions or too few carbon dioxide ions. And we've got different organ systems regulating each part of this. Our kidneys are responsible for the bicarbonate ions. Our lungs are responsible for the carbon dioxide. Okay. This means that if we are breathing too slowly, we are not getting rid of our carbon dioxide. This puts us in respiratory because this is lungs, acidosis because we have too much acidity in the blood plasma, because we have too much carbon dioxide. That too much carbon dioxide, ultimately because of the chemical reactions going on in your blood, means that we're also seeing an increase in hydrogen ions in that blood plasma, right? And if the problem is because you're not breathing right, the solution is going to be that your kidneys need to adjust, right? So if we're in respiratory acidosis, that means there's something wrong with our respiratory system, something wrong with our lungs, something wrong with our breathing. So in this case, where we would have renal compensation, the way we can compensate for this increase in acidity, so we can reabsorb a bunch of bicarbonate, so we've got more buffer in the blood. If it's super severe, maybe we even make new bicarbonate ions, pull them into the blood plasma, and we can speed up how many hydrogen ions we're secreting, how many hydrogen ions we're getting rid of. If we are in respiratory alkalosis, it means we are breathing too fast. We're getting rid of too much carbon dioxide, which means that carbon dioxide is no longer hanging around in your blood. So this is going to be paired with a decrease in hydrogen ions. Okay? And if the problem is the lungs, we're not going to fix it with the lungs. We're going to fix it with our kidneys. So our compensation here is going to be a decrease in how many hydrogen ions we're secreting, okay? Or we can decrease how many bicarbonate ions we're reabsorbing. So what we're doing here is trying to keep enough acid in the blood to keep us in that normal range. So we don't want to buffer it out, and we don't want to get rid of it in our urine. In our metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, we're thinking about a pH change that doesn't have to do with the lungs, so something else. If it's just your diet, both your lungs and your kidneys could adjust, but often we'll see it as a kidney problem, in which case we've got a renal problem, we can't compensate with our renal system, so you're going to compensate with your respiratory system. You're going to adjust your breathing. Okay, so if our problem is that we're too acidic, right? We have hydrogen ions in our blood for some reason. What we're going to want to do is to increase our ventilation, breathe off more CO2. So we're going to drop that CO2 down to balance it out. If the problem is your diet, not that your kidneys are broken, you could compensate with your renal system. That looks the same as for our respiratory acidosis compensation, right? We can get rid of hydrogen ions by secreting them. We can reabsorb bicarbonate ions, increasing the buffer in the blood. Or we can increase even how many new bicarbonate ions we're making by kicking in that glutamine type synthesis of bicarbonate in the proximal tubule. Finally, metabolic alkalosis, we've got decrease in our hydrogen ions for some reason other than carbon dioxide. Okay, so if this is a renal problem, we have to compensate using the respiratory system. So what we do was that we would slow down our breathing so that we keep CO2 in the blood. If it happens to be dietary or some other reason, we could also use our kidneys to compensate. And in this case, we are going to decrease our hydrogen ion secretion and decrease that reabsorption of bicarbonate. Sure. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we got a big chart of how we could test this. This really summarizes all that you would want to know. Okay. So the way we look at this is we're looking at our pH for changes outside of our regular range. We have a name for it, acidosis or alkalosis. Okay. And if we wanted to tell what type we have, we would check whether the problem is bicarbonate or whether the problem is carbon dioxide. Okay. So if the problem is carbon dioxide, you've got a respiratory situation going on, respiratory alkalosis or respiratory acidosis. If the problem is with the bicarbonate, you're gonna see that that's metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis, and the opposite system is gonna compensate. So if it's a respiratory problem, your kidneys are compensating. If it's a metabolic problem, we're really gonna have respiratory compensation. Okay, cool. All right, and that is all of it. We want to take a look and make an attempt at this last question. Do so. Want to take a picture? So this change in PCO2 to low CO2 means that it's respiratory, not enough acid, so we're alkalosis. And then that bicarbonate is low because the kidneys are kicked in.